joining. This is so exciting. And from all over. I think, did I see Indiana, Kentucky, Idaho, Maine? Gosh, that's so awesome. So yeah, Teresa's going to help me here, kind of help talk with you guys through it. I think I'm going to ask some questions, and then she can be able to kind of call on you and help and see which video we should have speak and answer the questions. But hopefully there are a lot of you, and I'm here to talk with you. So, feel free to ask the questions and speak as much as you want. As you can see, the topic that we're talking about today is learning about slavery in George Washington's world. So kind of what I do want to focus on is the historical inquiry process, so the study of how we learn about slavery. So I will be giving some background information on slavery at Mount Vernon, but I do want to talk about the research that goes into understanding. Does that sound good with everybody? Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes, so great. So first things first, let me get on here just to make sure I am a real person. Okay, so you are really hearing, that's me, Sadie Troy. I'm the lead student learning specialist at Mount Vernon. So this means that I work closely with all of our students and develop programming and resources to help with the classroom. So I want to show you my picture because I hope you guys know that Mount Vernon is here to help in all of your research. Do any of you do history projects for school, like National History Day, or what's another good one? We the People, or have to do research topics and study and write papers or build projects for it? Okay, yeah, I'm seeing, I see a We the People in Idaho, see a lot of yes coming in, great. Well, if you ever have questions, Mount Vernon is a great resource. I hope the one thing you learned today is that we are so much more than a field trip destination. We have a lot of great experts and information that we love helping students with their projects. Okay, so that's me. And as I said, I work at Mount Vernon. And can anyone tell me why Mount Vernon is important? Teresa, you want to help me call on somebody? Does anybody know?
I'm going to go ahead and go with Hayden. Hayden, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Hayden.
Hi, Hayden.
All right, I don't hear you, Hayden. So let's try Allie from South Creek.
Oh, cool. All right, Allie, can you tell us all why Mount Vernon's important?
I think Mount Vernon's important because Washington there.
Yeah, absolutely, because George Washington lived there. Yeah, I mean, you nailed it on the head. It was the home of George Washington. And can I get a few people that tell me why it's important? You already know about George Washington.
Can you say that again, Sadie? You broke up a little bit.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Can you still hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I was just wondering, I'm looking for people to tell me why George Washington was important. What are some things you know about him?
It looks like in our chat box, Sardi said he was the first president.
Great.
Kenlin said he led the war.
Absolutely. Does anybody know which war? Can you specify which war? He led the Revolutionary War. Jackson, I see that.
All right. Looks like we have an answer from Alfred Elementary. Alfred Elementary, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead.
He was a president.
Wonderful. What number?
First.
Beautiful. Do you know anything else about him while we have you on the speaker?
He led a war.
Mm-hmm. Do you know which war?
A war.
Mm-hmm.
Revolutionary War.
Absolutely. Yeah. It looks like some of our chat rooms were, helping you out too with that. Yeah. So the Revolutionary War is commander-in-chief. other things, people, he set the 2-term limit for president. That's a really great point that just came up in our chat room. His vice president was John Adams. Okay, so you guys know quite a bit about Washington. Continental Army, so let's see. So absolutely, he was the commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary War. Someone also said he fought in the French and Indian War. That's a war. He had wooden teeth. Lauren, I like that addition. That's a little bit of a myth about Washington. He had terrible teeth and used dentures for sure. By the time he was president, he only had one original tooth left. All the others had completely fallen out. So other things about him, he was a president. You guys all knew that. First president. I even think someone knew who his vice president was. And that was John Adams. Okay. So he was a leader on all different fronts. And then this picture showcases a lot of different things. Washington was a husband. He was a stepfather. He was a step-grandfather. And another thing that was important to us today, he was a slaveholder. That is kind of the topic we are absolutely going to be focusing on today. So I know that when I showed this picture of Mount Vernon, this is the house that Washington lived in. When we think of Mount Vernon, though, we really need to think kind of more along these lines, because Mount Vernon was a plantation. It was an 8,000-acre plantation. Entries, you want to see if someone can explain to us what a plantation is? Does anybody want to take an opportunity to give us a little background information on what a plantation is?
Sure. Please raise your hand if you have an idea of what a plantation is. It looks like Eagle Himmel has an idea. Eagle, I'm going to unmute you.
I think the plantation was mostly used for livestock to help raise stuff for the mountain.
Yeah, that you can see the livestock here. It was absolutely a farm that's raising livestock and animals. That's great. Who else has ideas?
It looks like Durga has an idea. Durga, I'm going to unmute you.
So a plantation was a place where enslaved people worked for their owner to raise crops, tend to animals, and other farmhand things.
Absolutely, that's a really great point. So yeah, a plantation is an extremely large, it's a large farm. And most of the work, especially in Washington's case, was done by enslaved people. And you hit it right on the head, because I want to show you this graphic. So when we think of Mount Vernon, it was the home of George Washington and his family, but it was also the home of a lot of different people. So if you guys see the graphic, you see the green people down here. So this is Washington's family members. So these are the individuals that he lived with, his wife, his grandchildren. The red, those are hired white servants and family members. So people like overseers or people who are working in his distillery and running the farms for him. And then the other people, those are all the enslaved individuals that worked at Mount Vernon. So in the year 1799, which is the year that Washington died, 317 enslaved people were living and working at Mount Vernon. They worked under and lived under Washington's control. Washington depended on their labor to build and maintain his household, his plantation. Some of the jobs that they were doing, Washington used enslaved labor to catch fish. He lived right on the Potomac River. The enslaved individuals were growing crops like tobacco and wheat. Those were cash crops that Washington was selling to make a large part of his income and his profit. Washington relied on enslaved people to operate his household. So people like Frank Lee and Caroline Branham worked long hours in the house without pay. They cleaned Washington's rooms, they laundered his clothing, they prepared his meals, they waited on all the guests. All of these individuals lived at Mount Vernon but had no legal rights. Okay? They were treated as property just like the items that they worked with. And a lot of these individuals, most enslaved people, never had the opportunity to become literate. So they didn't know how to read and write. They did not leave any written information about their lives, which is hard because as historians, one of the ways that we study the past is through studying written records and different primary sources, right? Like, how can we understand and learn about people who couldn't read or write? How can we learn about people who did not leave records of themselves? And that's kind of what I want to talk about in this chat, because that's what our historians at Mount Vernon do. To better understand the enslaved people who didn't leave us records, we become history detectives using our historical inquiry skills. We ask deeper questions and look for more clues in all different kinds of primary sources. And primary sources are incredible. How many in the chat for your schools, how many of you work with primary sources in the classroom? I see some even hands raised on the videos. Yeah. Oh, looks like Genevieve is real excited about those primary sources. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So yeah, everyone, Scarlett is using them, Gavin, Ben. So all teachers, which is awesome. So teachers are using them in the classrooms. Our historians are using them too. And since you guys have so much experience with them, can someone tell me what a primary source is? We can use the chat. I'll monitor that, Therese, if you want to see if anyone's got a hand raised. Does anyone want to share verbally what a primary source is?
Let's see. Dane Kelly from South Creek has an answer. Whoop, they just took their hand down, so maybe not.
Okay.
What about Gavin Woodrow? I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Gavin. Unmute.
A primary source was a source from that time that it was made in.
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, a source from the time that it was given. Looks like Sahada said it's an original source. There's a document from that time. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, they're kind of the raw materials of history. It's everything that's created in that time of the study that we're doing. It's something that comes from that time. Ben says a primary source is from the time. You guys are all completely, I'm just looking at the chat here. Yeah, you guys are all very experienced with this. And some of you have said that they're documents. Okay? But what are other kinds of primary sources that people research and study? Looks like Hayden says photos. Shahari says sculptures. That's great. Books. I see letters. Alyssa says journals and artifacts. Lauren's letters. This is great. Do you guys use these various kinds of primary sources in your classrooms? Movies, documents, quilts. Oh, good. Because I just listed out a few here. So documents, images, buildings, objects, music, biographies. Good job, Bryce. Yeah, all of these ideas are incredible. Painting, South Creek Reach. Yep, absolutely. I'm just reading the chat here for a few more. The walls on a home. Yes, that's a great one. Because buildings themselves can absolutely, fossils. That's something, yeah, we haven't even mentioned kind of artifacts coming from the ground. So great connection there with the fossils. Gavin says artifacts. Perfect. Yeah, so these are all different types, okay, of primary sources that we can use to study different parts of history. And so we have a lot of people that work at Mount Vernon studying this. And there are a lot of primary sources about George Washington. You guys knew a lot about it. You knew he was a first president. You knew that he was the commander in the Revolutionary War. You knew his vice president was John Adams. And it's probably because there are a lot of primary sources out there dedicated to Washington, right? You can study his diaries. I see that, South Creek Reach. That's a great one. His diaries, his journals, his letters. You know, we have historians that go through and read all these different types of documents that he left, letters to him, letters from him, newspapers. As you guys mentioned, the information in a wall, we have architects that work at Mount Vernon that peel back layers of all the different original buildings and find out information of the time. Hey, who are these guys digging in the ground? These are archaeologists, so that are, you know, finding all the different artifacts in the ground that tell about Washington and his family. We have curators. These are the individuals who study all the kind of objects and clothing that the Washingtons owned, objects that were created at Mount Vernon or bought for Mount Vernon. And they learn a lot about Washington's life through all these different types of studies. So we have historians studying Washington, we have architects, we have archaeologists, we have curators. So all this stuff, leaving items that Washington left and wrote. It's harder for them to study the enslaved individuals because they weren't leaving the same amounts of items, right? If they couldn't read or write, they weren't writing letters about their lives, they weren't writing diaries and leaving them. But there are still different ways to understand the same sources to learn about the enslaved individuals. This is where our staff kind of become those history detectives. So they can study the same objects, the same documents, the same buildings where they're learning about Washington, and just ask different questions to figure out how to study the enslaved people, okay? So what I want to do with all of us here today is our own primary source investigation. Okay? I want us to do this together to study the same Washington documents and find out information that, you know, normally people are using this to study Washington, but how can we deepen our study and actually learn about the enslaved population that lived here? So this is going to be a two-step process. Okay, this is the process that our curators and historians use when going through these objects. All right, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to analyze the source. So I'm going to put the source on the screen and I'm going to have everyone look at it, look over it, and then I'm going to ask different questions. And so I'm going to ask you different questions to help you guys observe the source. And then we're going to go a little deeper. We're going to reflect on the source. And then we're going to wonder about it and ask some more questions. And then the second step is going to be the key. The second step is the thing that curators do, and that's interpreting the source. So looking at the source, finding out what a main story is, but then looking deeper as to other layers of information that we can learn just from not just looking at it once, but what different information we can pull from. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So the first thing is I'm just going to have everybody kind of look over this image here. Okay. So take a look. We're going to kind of take this a few steps at a time. So first of all, what is this? Does anybody have any ideas of what this image is? Oh, all right. So I'm looking at the comments. Brandon, Shrihari, Hayden, yep. Eagle, Aubrey, yeah, you guys are all hitting it right on the head. So this is a map. All right, so this is, oh, people are even saying it's a map of Mount Vernon. That's correct. Okay, so this is a map of Mount Vernon. It's his plantation. Great observation, Kylie. All right, now I'm gonna have you guys, I'm gonna ask some questions and you can answer them in the chat box, and then maybe in a few moments we'll call on somebody to kind of put together their thoughts, all right? But as you're looking at this map, so what does it show? A lot of you already said it's a map of what Mount Vernon looked like. So yeah, so just a side note, this is a map of the 8,000 acre plantation. Okay. So just in case you don't understand how, or it's hard to picture what 8,000 acres are, picture 8,000 soccer fields lined up next to each other. A typical soccer field, that's about the size of an acre. So 8,000 soccer fields, okay? Feel like there was a question in the chat I wanted to answer too. Washington was a surveyor. Did he make this map himself? Stuart Mack, that is a great question. And so actually, yeah, Washington himself drew this map. So he is the one that created this map, all right? So I'm gonna keep asking these questions. So just kind of mentally think about, what does this map show? What do you notice first? What graphic elements do you see? Someone said, dang, there's a lot of land. And that is true. That is a lot of land. That's something that you notice first. It's how big it is. Okay. Graphic elements, someone pointed out the Potomac River. Someone pointed out a compass rose. Okay. These are great observations. What names? Are there any names included in this print that you can see? There are different names with fields. Someone found Mount Vernon. Someone found Muddy Hole Farm.
Scarlett has an answer.
Okay.
Scarlett, I'm going to unmute you.
I see Mount Vernon.
Where do you see Mount Vernon?
It's in like the top right-hand corner.
Okay, great. Yeah. So you actually see the name that it's labeled on the map. That's a really great way to first decide what something is see if it's labeled. And that's actually written as a map of George Washington's farms of Mount Vernon. Good. What else do you see? Someone saw Union Farm, the Potomac River.
Has an idea? Ben, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
The river farm.
Okay. Yeah, River Farm. You see that kind of down right by the Potomac River.
Aubrey, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you too.
Aubrey, what do you see?
I see the Dodge Rue Farm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And farm, and there's Dodge Creek.
Yeah, so there are a lot
of other stuff.
Yeah, so there, okay, so let's talk, so you guys are picking up a lot of, you guys are doing a great first observation of this. You've picked up on a lot of things. You see that it's Mount Vernon, a map of his large plantation that was right on, somebody saw at the Potomac River. And then you're all picking up on the different names. So this one farm was divided into 5 farm spaces. Each one had its own name. So you can see, does my mouse show up? If not, it's okay, but you have River Farm.
We see your mouse.
Great, so you have River Farm down here by the river. So Mansion House Farm. So if you can kind of see this little drawing down here, this is Washington's house and all of the outbuildings that were close by. So this is where Washington and his family lived. You have Muddy Hole Farm, Dogue Run Farm that you guys saw, and then Union Farm. So these are all farms. What do you guys think this stuff in the middle is? All this kind of stuff that's not divided in parts. Trees. Great. Yeah. So someone saw, so it's trees. So this is all woods. Yep. Hayden or Stuart Mack, you were right. This is all woods. And so these farms here, this is where all of the crops are being grown. You can see it's all kind of divided into different plots. This is where the tobacco and the wheat are growing. Okay. Now, the next step that a curator does after they look at an object and they observe it, they reflect on it. All right, so kind of start thinking, why do you think this map was made? Who do you think the audience was for this map?
It looks like we have some hands raised.
Yeah.
Eagle, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
I think some of the stuff over here might be some wheat.
Okay.
And I think he grew off wheat and corn.
He did.
His farm was able to sustain for him, his slaves, and his family. Or he didn't need to go and buy stuff from the town.
Absolutely. So that is a big thing. So Washington, yeah, Mount Vernon was a self-sustaining plantation. So food was grown there, and the wheat, like you said, was grown there to sell in stores and make the money. Okay? So it looks like the chat box is kind of filling up, that the audience for this, or that it was created to show, let's see, Shrihari says to show what Washington owned. Great. The audience people think could have been his family. Brandon wrote that. Possibly designed this to show Washington's land. Absolutely. Cora said it's to know where things are. Yeah, and as somebody said earlier, yeah, to keep a record, that's also really important. Washington was a surveyor. So this is important to know where his land is, how big the farms were, what fields were growing. Absolutely. Did he fish in the river or in a pond? In the river. That's a great question, Stuart Mack. He was fishing in the Potomac River. It was said that every year, when it was time to catch the fish and the enslaved people went out during the month of April, they would catch 1 million shad. That's the type of fish. So they would catch 1 million shad, and that fish would then be salted. Some would be sold, and some would be used as rations for the enslaved people for the entire year. Okay. Now the third step, so we've observed the map. We've reflected that it was probably made for Washington to know what land he owned, to see all the different areas. But now we want to wonder about, what can we learn about slavery at Mount Vernon from this map? Let's think of it now in the terms of the enslaved population. What can we learn about them from this map? Hayden says how much they had to work. Brandon said that the Washingtons were rich. Everett and Stephanie said where the enslaved people lived and worked. And that's great. Do we have Everett and on the line? Can they maybe explain and say how they know where the enslaved people lived and worked?
Sure. Everett and Stephanie, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Everett and Stephanie.
Yeah, what on the map showed you where the enslaved people lived in?
Well, it seems like some of it says field on different parts of the farm.
Okay.
And we just assumed, I mean, it says mansion house farm. We were assuming there was housing on there as well somewhere.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, the fields, they're obviously, that's great. So yeah, the fields are going to be working. Let's see, people were saying they have a lot of food to get the money. They had a lot of work to do because the land was so big. So this is incredible. And so I do want to talk a little bit about this map, because you can see these are the farms. This is where all those crops were growing. So you are absolutely right. And you can see how large, like this one here, this plot right here, it says 70 acres. Okay, so that's 70 soccer fields right there that they're plowing and growing the corn. They must have had a lot of food for the crops. Carson, you're absolutely right. Okay, now it's kind of hard to see, but if you look closely, so at the Mansion House Farm, you see there are all these outlines for the buildings here, and we have the house and some of the outbuildings. Does anyone see any other things that look like this on the map? Anybody see any dark little squares? Other places on the map? All right, I see some yeses in there. Okay. Next to Union Farm, right here, yep. Right next to Union Farm. So you have cabins here. Someone said near River Farm, right here. Yes. All right, so these are more buildings, and so these are cabins where the enslaved people were living. Okay, and so this map is not only helpful to learn about how big Mount Vernon is, but where different communities of enslaved people were living. You see some people are pointing right next to Dogue Run Farm, so it's here. Union Farm, you guys point out you found them on River Farm. So yeah, this is great to teach us different things with different layers. So some things you didn't see right away, but deeping through when you go through the observations, the reflection, and then wondering about it. Okay, now you guys are all hitting this next to Dogue Run Creek, next to River Farm. Awesome. I'm loving how you're finding this. Now, the second step that our curators do is they interpret. So this map is just, it's an unfinished story. It gives us some information, but it doesn't give us everything. So the next things that curators do is they start making educated guesses. All right, so they use the knowledge that they already have of the time period to push ideas. And so we're gonna do that. And so together, we're gonna walk through this story routine, okay? And so what our curators do is after looking closely or reading at the objects, they ask themselves, what is the main story? You know, what is the most important thing, that the first level of information that's being documented, okay? And then they go deeper and they say, what's the side story? So what's kind of happening around the edges that may not necessarily involve the main characters? You guys have picked that up. Kind of what is that next level of information we can learn from it? And finally, what is that hidden story? What's that last layer that may not jump at you right away, but it comes out? So we're gonna do that. I'm gonna put this item back up. All right, so I'm gonna ask you guys, so what is the main story of this map? Okay, it looks like the main story might be what land George Washington owned. That's a great one, Everett and Stephanie.
It looks like
Brian
Ben has an answer.
Okay,
Ben,
yeah.
Go ahead and unmute you.
The lands that George Washington owns.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. So that's kind of that main story. The reason why he did this was how much land he owned. Hayden said how much land the slaves had to work. Absolutely, because they were the ones doing all of that.
It looks like Rowan has an answer. Rowan, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Rowan.
The land also represents what buildings were there and what was the surrounding areas, such as rivers and etc.
That's awesome. Yeah. So it shows the different, absolutely. So like not only where Mount Vernon is, but where the buildings and then what the other land is. So where it is in relation to the water. A couple of you have asked what the different letters are. So some of these different letters like A and B, that's where Washington's land ends and someone else's begins. So that plot of land on A was owned by someone else. B belonged to George Mason. We have any older kids in the room maybe studying George Mason in your class one day, for he was another famous founding father. So yeah, it shows Mount Vernon in relation to the whole, land in the area, to the topography. Awesome. Now, does anyone want to talk about, let's dive into the side story. Like, what do you think is a second layer of information that this can tell us? I'll put it back up, like let's see if I can get it back. Like what is kind of that kind of information that might be on the outside, the out layers? How long it took to get the land? Brandon, that's a good one. Do you think that this was inherited overnight? A second great one, is where the slaves live. So you see where people are living in comparison.
It looks like Sadhana has an answer. Sadhana, unmute you.
I was thinking that it would show like the where the slaves would live in comparison to the farms, so like where the labor was like happening.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a really great one. That is something, so this is telling us where slaves live. So they're living by where they're working. So when they have these cabins here, what do you think the community that lives in these cabins, what do you think their jobs are? Do you think that they live in these cabins and then every day they walk to George Washington's house on Mansion Farm and clean the house? Yeah, it looks like a lot of you, they're not doing that. Everett said they work in the fields nearby. Hayden said farm the fields. Brandon said they go to the farm. That's absolutely right. That's a great connection that by looking at this map, we can understand not just where the buildings are, but the connection that the enslaved workers' living spaces have to their working spaces. Lauren said all of the above. Cora said getting water. Look at how close these are to the creeks, okay, for their water supply. Excellent. Okay. Now, what do you think the hidden story is? What do you think the deepest level of information that we can learn from this map? Kind of one, like, what with those really deeper questions that we asked ourselves. Does anyone know a further one? How to take care of a farm, how wealthy Washington was. That's a very big sign, something that you wouldn't necessarily think about. What first, when you look at this map, you might just see about its location, but once you dive in, if all of these fields are grown with cash crops, they would be making him a lot of money. If he is having this many enslaved individuals, it's probably a very large plantation worth a lot of money. So absolutely, it's going to talk about his wealth without that necessarily being the first thing, especially Brandon realizes how much tobacco cost and made people. I'm just reading your comments. These are great. So yeah, so this is awesome. This is one of the things that if you guys want to stick with me for a couple more minutes, I have another source that I want to do because this just shows how much we can learn. So even though Washington created this, and at first you don't assume that it's going to teach anything about slavery at Mount Vernon, there are all these pieces of information we just walked away with. How many cabins were listed on the different farms? How many of the different farms the enslaved people were farming it by their work being so close, or there are these great deeper levels. Let's see, the other source that I would like to show you, oops, I'm gonna go back, is this. This is a real Washington document. So it's kind of hard to read, so I'll give you a couple minutes with this one. But then I have a typed version of it that I can show you, okay? But this is, well, let's figure it out. What is it? Does anybody know? Any first guesses on what this is? I can go to the next slide if people are having trouble reading the cursive. So I'll give you a look at this, okay? South Creek Reach said a list of slaves. Braden said a slave list. Hayden said a list. And you guys are right. If you can kind of see this a little better, this is a list of enslaved peoples that Washington made in 1799. Okay. So I'm going to have you guys kind of look it over, and I'm going to go back. We're going to do that same analysis and interpretation. So we're going to start with our observations. A lot of you are already answering these. What are things you notice first? What words stand out to you? So let's see, people are finding names that stand out. I know, I'm sorry, it's kind of blurry, the screen here. People are looking at the count of slaves. They're looking at names. Someone saw the word children that stood out to them. Some saw the word dower that stood out to them. Okay. What did you notice that you didn't expect to see or you can't explain? So a lot of you are seeing that names are standing out. Now, let's look at the reflection part. Why do you think this document was made? We're going to start asking a little deeper questions. Why do you think this document was made? Who do you think the audience was for this document? Hayden says, oh, go ahead.
It looks like Cora Allen has an answer. So Cora, I'm gonna unmute you.
It could be to keep track of the slaves and how many there are.
Absolutely, yeah, this is a list, because remember that image that we saw with all the different slaves that lived at Mount Vernon? There were 300 of them. So this is a list of who everyone was. Bryce said this was for a census. That's a great guess. A census that maybe Washington submitted to the government, or maybe he just kept it for himself. Okay. At the top, Jackson found that it was listed. It actually has a title that says List of Enslaved People, 1799. It was a way for Washington to keep record of all slaves. Great. Why do you think this document is so important? Kind of another great reflection question. For the census, Benra? Oh,
sorry. It looks like
no,
Pranav
go ahead.
has an answer. So Pranav, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead. Well, we can't.
Can you say that one more time? So if one of the slaves tried to escape from George Washington, there would be a list of names for him. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's it, to have a list of who's who. Does anybody see any of the names of the farms that we were talking about earlier?
It looks like Rowan has an answer. Rowan, I'm going to unmute you.
I see some of the farms, such as Muddy Hole Farm.
Okay.
And that's pretty much all the only farm I can see.
Okay, so you see Muddy Hole, yep, right there. It's great. Sardi, it looks like you seeing names makes them feel real. That we will circle back to that. Someone mentioned they saw Mansion House Farm. Good find, Everett and Bryce. So what do you think? Yeah, so what's that telling us? If their names are under individual places? Because that's kind of a question that's going to lead into our wonder section. So what can we learn about slavery at Mount Vernon from this document? What can we learn about the enslaved population?
It looks like Sadhana has an answer. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Sadhana. Go ahead.
It shows us where each like individual slave worked at, maybe like which like part of the plantation.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great connection. I mean, it shows us that, let's see, some of you are having trouble reading it, but it says Gabriel. He's under the Muddy Hole Farm list. Peg, Alice, Amy, Nancy. So yeah, absolutely. You guys are kind of very much understanding that this is a list not only just of their names, but of the locations that they're living. Some of you saw that there were children. Okay? So now that we've kind of analyzed this document, I do want to go back to the interpretation questions. So the main story, what's the main story here that you guys pulled from looking at this? Like what, at its first glance, simply what is this document? Brandon says he has a lot of slaves. That's absolutely right.
It looks like Scarlett has an answer. Scarlett, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, she put her hand down.
Okay. Hayden says this is amount of slaves he owned. That's true. Yeah. So this is just so at first glance, this is a document. It's telling us who these people, or that who were some of the enslaved people that Washington had. What's a side story? What's kind of an what's a second layer of information or emotion that you guys are getting from this? Besides just being a list, what's other information that you're learning?
All right, Scarlett, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead.
That like it shows where they work and like where they
Yeah, where their job was. Absolutely. So we find out kind of where they worked, what their trades were. And if we combine that with the map we just looked at, we can figure out maybe some of the houses that they lived in. But yeah, this is where it's making the connection of the enslaved people to the individual farms. That's great. I want to touch on what some of you are talking about in the chat. Sardi, I think one of the great things that you picked up on, and I think this is going to be one of our hidden stories from this, is that they had families and that families lived there. Because look at some of the lists. I know, I'm sorry that some of you, it might be blurry for you, but if we look at that first line under Muddy Hole Farm, it says Gabriel, it says he's 30 years old, and then it says that his wife is Judy, is 19, and that he's son to Darkus. It says over here under Mansion House that Rachel, she's 12, she's the daughter to Caroline. Okay. Some of you are noticing there are even small little babies here, okay? All different ages. It says Kate old. What does that mean? So Kate, it means old. It means that she's probably too old to actually do physical labor at Muddy Hole Farm. So that means that what she would be doing would be watching the younger children in the cabins. Okay. Some of them don't have ages, some of you pointed out. That's a really great hidden thing to pull out, because enslaved people, since they were treated as property by people like Washington, not all of their birth dates were always recorded. Not all of their information was written down. So these are kind of great little hidden stories that, yeah, we get to see names of these individuals and where they worked, but now we're learning about the communities that they were creating amongst themselves, because slavery was an incredibly hard institution. It was based around violence. It was based around the fear of being sold, but these individuals still created lives among themselves. They had families, they had children, to work through these hardships. And so this is some of the great information when you fully dive deeper and ask different questions that pop out from these topics. Okay, what do babies do for their work? Babies don't do anything. Even in the enslaved community, the first job that people had was when they turned about 9 and 10. Okay, so think about it. It looks like some people in this chat maybe around 9 or 10. And the first jobs that the enslaved children would take on would be collecting water to bring to the kitchen, or babysitting some of the helping the older enslaved individuals babysit the younger children while the adults and parents were out working in the fields or working in the kitchen or working in the house. Okay. So that's kind of the routine we just did once again. And my final slide here that I'm just pointing out is just to highlight the different ways that we can study slavery at Mount Vernon. And just because people weren't leaving their own individual records because they couldn't read or write, it doesn't mean that we can't learn about their lives the same way we learn about George Washington. We just have to ask different questions. We just have to really become those history detectives and dive deeper into the process. Okay. I'm gonna look at the chat and start asking, answering some of your questions for just a couple more minutes if we have time. How old would they be to show as old? So typically, because of the hardship of labor within the enslaved community, we can go back to that, I think. Let's see if we have anybody. Typically, old age was reached at about 50 years old. So it's a lot younger than we think today. But as you can see, some of the individuals over here, like Davy and Will, they're still working at different ages. They're just listed, and sometimes old is just listed because they don't know the exact age, but they're over 50 years old. When would slaves stop working? So they would stop working when physically, age-wise, they just couldn't do it anymore, where they couldn't keep up with the pace. the overseers in Washington would assign them to new jobs. And that would typically be roles like taking care of the younger children. Their day-to-day jobs all depended on sunrise to sunset. So at Mount Vernon, the enslaved community worked 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, sun up to sundown. They worked every day, except they received a few days off at Christmas. Other questions that I saw that people had. How did the families get to see each other? Alyssa, that's a great question. So some families lived in the same area, and so they all worked on the same farms, but some we know, like there's a case of Slammin' Joe. That was his name. Slammin' Joe was a ditch digger. He was married to Priscilla. Slammin' Joe lived at the Mansion House farm close to where Washington lived, and Priscilla lived, let's go back to that map. Slammin' Joe lived on Mansion House farm in one of these outbuildings, and his wife Priscilla lived on Union Farm here in one of these buildings. So Monday through Saturday, they did not see each other. Slammin' Joe was separated from his wife and 6 kids, but on Sundays, he would make the walk. It's about a 2-mile walk to go see him and his wife and children, and then on Monday morning, walk back for work. Okay? It is sad, as Brandon pointed out. Slavery is an extremely sad institution, and it's important to talk about with Washington, because there are those incredible things, as you guys said, that Washington was this leader and made these great decisions that pushed our country forward and became president and set up all these great ideas. But he did partake in institutions that did hold our country back, and we're still affected by those ramifications. And so it's important to keep studying items like this to learn better about that topic and how to correct the wrongs that Washington and the other founding fathers did. Teresa, I don't know how much time we have. I wanted to check in with you on that.
Sure, we have about 5 minutes, and we have a couple people with their hands raised, if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah, no, I would love to answer their questions.
Okay, Wyatt, you have your hand raised. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead, Wyatt.
Why did he have so many slaves?
So great question. So Washington had a lot of slaves, mainly for all the labor that he needed to run his plantation. Because I know that we all said, you all knew the great things that Washington did. He was a president, he was the commander-in-chief of the army, but first and foremost, Washington he made throughout his life. People were asking why he was so rich. All of that money comes from the plantation. So the enslaved individuals were the ones doing the hardship labor to provide that wealth. So he had a lot of slaves that were working in the fields, growing the wheat, growing the tobacco. Those cash crops provided him a lot of money. They were working in his grist mill to take corn and turn it into cornmeal and flour. They worked in his distillery to turn that corn and wheat into whiskey that he would sell. The enslaved people worked in his house. They built his home. They built his outbuildings. He had blacksmiths. He had cobblers who made shoes. He had gardeners who grew all the vegetable gardens and the fruit gardens to provide food for Washington and his family. He had painters. He had carpenters. So there were quite a few different jobs that the enslaved people had. Therese, was there to follow up? That's a great question, though.
It looks like we have time for about one more question.
Okay.
How about, let's see, Alfred Elementary, you have your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead and ask this? I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Alfred Elementary.
Wait, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, I didn't know that was me. How young could a slave be before? How young could they be before they became a slave?
So that's a really great question. And there are kind of two answers to it. So slavery was a institution, or was a, slavery was, I guess, an institution. It was a situation that you inherited from your mother. So if a baby was born to a woman who was a slave, that baby was considered a slave and considered property not of its mother, but of the owner. So in this case, George Washington. And so the baby would be considered an enslaved person from birth, but they didn't begin their work on the plantation until about the age of 9 or 10. That's when they would help bring water or firewood to the kitchen, when they would babysit the younger individuals. And then at 11 years old, that's when the first jobs, official jobs, would be given. And that could either be working in the fields or apprenticing in the blacksmith shop or learning how to be a carpenter. Okay.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. I apologize for anyone that we didn't get to your questions. There were a lot of people here. But we will be back at 2 if you want to come back and ask your questions. But thank you again for joining us. Sadie, thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. And remember Mount Vernon for all of your projects. If you guys have questions, our website's great, and it's got our email addresses to help answer any specific questions you have.
Perfect. So definitely check out their website if you didn't get your question answered. Everybody have a great afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you again. Bye.